Today we decided that I would talk to you all a bit about scientific publications. As I look at the Hollywood squares here, I don't see a lot of people that are writing papers. So maybe this will be helpful to you as you advise some of our faculty that we work with on conducting studies and the like. In any event, my prepared remarks will be relatively brief, and we can have a dialogue on any of those things that Sarah mentioned. I'm really delighted to be part of this team, and I feel like this lunch and learn concept is very informal. So even though, as you'll see, I prepared a few slides, it really is just so that I don't forget points to make as I talk through the concept of how to publish a quality paper. So let me see if I'm able to share. It looks like I am. That's a good step. All right. Hopefully you can see that, folks. Good. Okay. Right. So publishing your research in a high impact journal. Now, I have to sort of start from square one, and perhaps there are enough people on the call who will find this rudimentary, but just so that we're all on the same page. One of my favorite courses in college was the philosophy of science. I enjoyed philosophy a lot in college. And I was taught at that time that science is just one way of looking at the world. There are many. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's the only way, but we have adopted that way of looking at the world. You can see this every day in the news when people talk about the science of how we deal with the coronavirus and how important that is. And the science involves a logical progression of ideas. It's you observe something, you come up with one or more hypotheses. If something happens, then something else would happen. That's a hypothesis. And then you design experiments to test those hypotheses, and then you publicize and publish the results of those experiments, which generally lead to more either observational work or more hypotheses or more testing. So it's a kind of a big circle. And of course, you all know people who've made careers in this. We've got several Nobel laureates in residence at the MGH these days, and more to come, I'm sure. So the place is steeped in this whole idea of the scientific methodology. And I dwell on that for a minute or two in the beginning, because it's foundational to understanding what makes a high quality scientific publication. What I observed when I was more in the side of this business of sending papers to journals rather than editing a journal was that people somehow would forget those basic concepts, which is, again, why I emphasized them in the beginning, and would either cut corners or they talk about the outcome we want of an experiment. The outcome you want is the truth. And if you design your experiments well, you can publish the truth, however it turns out. And I say that because I think people have to remind themselves and relearn what this is all about. So many times people, especially in our environment, are driving their career agenda by the number of publications that they get, and yes, the quality as well. And of course, almost anything you do in science will find a home in the peer-reviewed literature. That some people then will go for quantity as opposed to quality, and they'll start to publish things that maybe are slightly less interesting or less provocative or less innovative. And remember, this is an innovation center. So it's in that context that I lay out the following 4 or 5 sets of principles from the point of view of an editor. So indeed, the first step is to design high quality research. And I've taken a couple of analogies from the food industry, but I'm sure those of you who cook or have seen or cooking shows or whatnot, the best chefs only use the best ingredients, and they'll tell you that the best cooking is the best ingredients, and you don't do too much to it. You season it lightly, etc. But if you have don't have very good ingredients, you won't come up with a very good dish. And of course, one of my favorites is winemakers who will tell you that if they have, they can't make good wine out of poor quality fruit. They can make lousy wine by screwing up good fruit, but they can't make good wine out of poor quality fruit. So when you go to basically design your research, think that way. And the next slide, I'm going to go through this in more detail. But there are all kinds of guidelines now. When I was starting my career doing research, that wasn't the case. But I've put in this link, and these slides can be made available. There's nothing particularly proprietary here. But the Equator Network website has all of them, whether it's the consort guidelines for clinical trials, or there's guidelines for review papers and how you get a quality review paper. And I would advise people to familiarize yourself with that website and all of those guidelines, especially if you decide, well, we're going to do a review. Well, go read up on what a quality review is and follow it. Because again, if you want to get your paper into a high quality journal, you've got to start with the basics of good ingredients. So that's step one. And again, the blueprints are there for us. The other thing I'll say about hypothesis-driven research is that there's always going to be, it's never perfect. There's always going to be some downfall. There's going to be some caveat. There's no way of doing perfect, especially with human beings, perfect research. Maybe you can do perfect experiments with DNA and cells in the lab and so forth. But when you get to working with people, there's always some caveat. But your job when you're designing experiments is to make sure you minimize those caveats and to do a good job in the beginning, because once again, you'll never make a good paper out of a lousy design. It won't happen. So choose your journal wisely. There are really I think two types of journals. And I mentioned in the beginning, high impact. So very, very briefly, again, to set the table, journals these days are ranked by what's called an impact factor. The impact factor is a measure of how often the work in the journal is cited by other investigators in their papers compared to the amount of publications in that journal. So it's a ratio type calculation. And it can vary anywhere from 1 or 2 to the very kind of pedestrian journals up to a journal like Science or Nature or New England Journal, 45, 50 in that range. So and the higher the impact journal, as you can imagine, the more difficult it is to get your paper published there, because most of what they get, they turn away. And they're very thoughtful about what they take. Now, some journals will send everything out for review. Those are usually the journals with the lower impact factors. They're more about quantity of papers published than quality. Again, no value judgment on that. It's a different strategy. When you send a paper to my journal, NPJ Digital Medicine, we're going to end up using an associate editor to handle the review process. But we reject about 50% of them because they're just not a good fit. And these days, with the preponderance of interest in digital medicine, both on the telehealth side, on the artificial intelligence side, digital therapeutics, I mean, stuff is breaking out all over the place. We do have people who, I would say, choose to apply a digital tool to a fundamental problem and call it a digital medicine paper. My probably best example of that is in radiology, with using artificial intelligence algorithms to find new patterns in radiology images. We generally don't review those papers because there's plenty of radiology journals, and the use of AI in radiology is no longer an innovation from a digital medicine perspective. So half of them go right back to the authors with a polite note that says this just isn't for us. Another 25% or so get rejected because the science is flawed. And again, I'm going to spend a little more time on that here momentarily. But and then about the bigger, I guess, point I'm making about the style of our journal is that if you get reviewed, not always, but there's a high likelihood you're going to end up getting your paper published. It may take 2 or 3 rounds of revision. Our reviewers tend to be very picky. The process tends to go on for a while. But if you make that hurdle, the chances are high that it will get published. Again, there are other journals who send everything out for review. Reviewers reject a lot of papers, so you can't always say that's the case. But the higher the impact, usually people will be more likely, once they review your paper, to see it through. Not always, but it's just a rule of thumb. So just to remind everyone, there really are 4 types, categories of research type papers. So observational studies are quite popular. This is where, in this day and age, there are all these data sets out there, right? We have access at MGB to the research patient data registry, for instance. So all of the data from our electronic record has been cleansed and de-identified and made available to investigators. So if you wanted to study, I don't know, patients with heart failure who went on to get a VAD device, you can go in and say, well, 40% did X or 30% did Y. That's called observational research, because you really didn't say why or what your hypothesis as to why you found those things. Observational research, and as I alluded to earlier when I was talking about scientific method, observational research is meant to generate hypotheses. That's why you do it. So my request to people sending us papers that are observational is, what's the point? Tell us who cares. What's next? What are you going to do with this? We don't take many observational papers because, again, there's lots of homes for them. Now, we prefer hypothesis-driven research, but we do sometimes if it's really, really cutting edge and innovative, or maybe it involves a project. We recently put a paper out to review that involved a huge project in the EU, and we just felt like it was noteworthy enough that we would put it out for review. But observational studies are easy to do for the most part. Nothing's easy, but they're easy to do because you're not asking for a control group. You're not testing a hypothesis. You're just collecting data and analyzing it and then telling people what you find. So a lot of people early in their career will build out papers of this type. And again, there's nothing wrong with it, but just keep in mind that it's got to go somewhere. There's got to be some point. Just tell me there's 50% color X of this sample and 25% color Y. And people do this in enough detail that you fall asleep reading the papers. That's not really helpful. It's because I think there's 50% red because, and that's what I'm going to test next. And that makes the paper at least somewhat interesting. So hypothesis-driven papers, and I'm going to spend more time on that on the next slide. That's kind of the sweetheart spot for really high-quality clinical research. And people, it's kind of amazing to me, having taken this role 19 months ago as an editor-in-chief, how many corners people try to cut and get away with it. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, because there's no point in sending in flawed research, at least to our journal. I guess there's some who may have it reviewed and sometimes they'll take it, but I don't think there's much point in it. So design something up front that will yield the truth or something close to the truth, and then tell the story of the truth. That's kind of the formula for doing high quality research. So just to finish out the types of reviews, and there's 2 types, scoping and systematic reviews. Again, if you go to the Equator Network, you can see guidelines on how to do a good review. There are methodologies for doing reviews. Reviews are time consuming. They take a lot of work. Usually, again, junior people will do reviews because, once again, there's very little risk in doing, especially if you do a high quality review. Typically, it's going to be welcomed by the journal because they get cited a lot. So again, they help with that impact factor thing I was talking about. And people find them of interest. That's why they get cited a lot. So if you have an interesting topic that the world wants to know more about, and there's been papers written on it, a good chunk, not 5 or 10 papers, but maybe 20, maybe 50, that you can cull down and talk about, then that's a good project. If you do too many of those, you might not get promoted at a place like Harvard Medical School because they want to see original work, but there's no harm in doing reviews. Again, time consuming, but low risk. And then opinion pieces, editorials, perspectives, etc. We like those, but we get a lot of them. So the bar for us to take one is higher. I'll say just a word or two about opinion pieces because most investigators don't spend a lot of time on them. They're not, promotions committees don't think as highly of them as they do individual hypothesis driven studies. Sometimes you get invited to write an editorial. That's different than sort of a priori sending one in. But my request for people writing opinion pieces is tell us what the context, it's really a formula. Tell us the context of why we should care about this topic that you're so passionate telling us your opinion about. What is your unique insight? And what should we do as an audience as a result? So many of them that I see fall flat on that latter category because they come in and they'll tell you this is an amazing, this and that and the other thing. And we had this unique insight. And then I'm left saying, so what, right? Who cares? Don't just educate me on your insight. What do you want me to do about it? So something for you to think about if you're going to do opinion pieces and send them in. That, by the way, if you, I know again, a lot of people on the call are not hardcore scientists. If you're going to send an opinion piece like to an op-ed, I'd say follow the same formula for a newspaper op-ed. All right, so this is going to get a little geeky here, and I'm just watching the clock, so I want to leave plenty of time for Q&A. So I will probably glance over this like stones, skipping stones over a body of water, and I don't mean for it to be too geeky, but it is. If anyone really wants to publish research, this is the core of it, and feel free to contact me, and we can go over it in more detail if you want. The issue that comes up most often in study designs in clinical research is a small sample size. And what can happen with a small sample size is you can do one of two things wrong. You can find a statistically significant result that is an error because you just didn't look in enough people. That's called a type 1 error. Again, I'm choosing not to go over the null hypothesis and all that because every time I learned it in college and medical school, it put me to sleep. I'm trying to be practical here. But if you simply look at 30 people and you see a 20, maybe there's a significant difference in 30 people. If you looked at 100, that difference might go away because you just happen to look at 30 people early in the process of whatever it is you're looking at. By chance, you did that. And so that's called a type 1 error. Another one that I see a lot of is people who find no difference in their two samples. And then they say there's no difference. If there is a difference and you just didn't look hard enough, that's a type 2 error. And we don't take those papers as well. And this fundamentally comes down to something called the power calculation. There is a formula that you use. If you have an intervention X and you want to, and you say, well, I want 80 or 90% likelihood that I'm going to find a difference and this and that, you plug those numbers into a formula and it will say you need to have a sample size of 300 to make that claim. And if you wanted to demonstrate that the two samples that you're looking at are not any different, that's called equivalence. It typically is a much larger number that you need. So people go into it saying, oh, I think there's a difference between X and Y. That's going to take me 200 subjects. You get your 200 subjects and there's no difference, and they try to publish that. It's not going to fly because it's not powered to look for equivalence. So again, that's a little bit geeky. The one other thing I'll mention, and all of this, as I said, I'll say it again, is on the Equator Network website under the consort guidelines. There are things you'd always include a diagram of how you arrived at your subject groups. Another rule of thumb when you're doing this kind of work is just keep track of everything. So you might need 200 people. You might start out by recruiting from a database of 1,000 And of those 1,000, maybe 400 say don't meet your criteria. Make a note of that number and why. And then another, say 200 met your criteria, but they chose not to participate in the study. Make a note of that. And if you know anything about those groups, share that with your readers, because that's going to help them decide. Remember, I said there's always caveats. If you unwittingly, going through that process, bias your sample, then your readers are going to have to know that, and that's going to be a limitation of your study. So a good exercise when you're designing in the design phase is just visually picture your paper. What are the tables you think that are going to be in the results? What are the figures? And just like a good reporter, you know, when someone dies and there's an obituary that comes out that day in the news, it isn't because those reporters drop what they're doing. They had that piece written, or even a better example is a sports writer will write 2 pieces during the game, one in which the team wins and one in which the team loses, and then they just quickly modify at the end. So think about your paper as your hypothesis. If it's success, if it's A result, what that will look like. If it's B result, what that will look like. That's really helpful in designing, because that way you won't run into things when you're writing the paper and say, oh my God, I didn't keep track of that and I wish I had. And the second good exercise is just to think about as many criticisms that, and this is, I mean, experience helps with this. So hopefully you have someone senior on your team, but what will reviewers say? What will they pick out? Because my experience in, again, sending papers is all of the things that you do on this slide and still reviewers will tear the work apart. So just don't give them anything to tear the work apart on. Be proactive, design as well as you can as you do it. All right, some common writing errors, and then we'll wrap up this section. Wasted cover letter. Every journal gives you an opportunity to put a cover letter in. That's your opportunity to give me, the editor, some context as to why I should care about your science. Tell me why it's important. Tell me what your breakthrough is. Tell me anything like that. I mentioned earlier that we just reviewed or sent a paper for review from a very large EU project. I almost rejected that paper without review because it was pretty highly technical. But my co-editor said, no, wait, that's an important project in the EU, which I didn't know. And the people sending the paper said nothing about it in the cover letter. So really use your cover letter. It's an opportunity for you to frame your work. It's amazing to me that how people's writing, I don't know, I guess maybe we don't teach English anymore, or we don't teach it well, but there are programs like Grammarly. Just plug one in, use your common sense, use your grammar helper, just write high quality sentences. One of my favorite, the third bullet is from Mark Twain. If I had more time, I would have written it shorter. It really is, I can't emphasize enough how brevity and conciseness really helps both your readers eventually and your editors for sure. Try to minimize jargon. And I mentioned who cares earlier, but I think a lot of scientists assume that we're going to care. And most science is highly technical and highly nuanced. You have to tell the reader why they should care. And that's your opportunity with your introduction and discussion. Write it in as much of plain English as you can, not a lot of jargon, not a lot of, winking at the audience thinking, well, if you know, you know. That's not the way to write a paper, in my opinion. And the other error I see a lot is people will say, they'll put in 2 or 3 paragraphs in the results and then restate all of that in a table or a figure. Your tables, figures, and your text should all marry one another, so there's very little redundancy. Editors and journal, they don't like that. They're going to ask you to trim it if you do it that way. And then, of course, everything should be clearly labeled. So that's a little bit of a whirlwind tour through this area. As I said, I can see that most of you are either going to be maybe helping others with this. So feel free to engage me. As I said, I can make these slides available. The last thing I want to say before we open it up for Q&A is just to throw a bone or a a shout out really to ATA. Sarah mentioned I'm the chairman of the board. Gina Cella, who's on this call, does PR for ATA as well. It's an amazing organization, and because of the growth in telehealth over the last 18, 20 months, it's just really come into its own. We represent over 450 organizations from both the provider, supplier, payer side, and it's the one place where we advocate to move the industry forward. We find the rising tide floats all boats issues and moves them forward. And we have meetings twice a year. The next one coming up will be in person in DC. It may be hybrid as well, but it will certainly be in person. It's on policy. So if anyone has interest in policy, MGB is an ATA member. Any one of you can become more involved with it. And then we have our annual meeting in May of 2022. That's in Boston. So again, another opportunity to get close to the organization if you like. So I appreciate your time. I'm going to stop sharing now, and then we'll take questions. Thank you.
So if anyone has a question, why don't you use your little hand raiser emoji thingy under, I think it's under reactions. Is that right? Yeah, under reactions. But Joe, I'll start. I have a question that kind of crosses both your NPJ digital medicine world and ATA and just data and digital health at large at MGB. The organization right now is going through this remote patient monitoring strategy, right? And trying to identify what types of data we want to collect from who, and I'm interested to hear, you know, as both an academic with the academic lens, but also just pragmatic patient care. How do we take better care of patient lens? What data do you think will be most important as we think about, you know, our digital health and specifically RPM strategy?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I'd put it in two categories, I guess. One is what I would call physiologic, mostly physiologic. So things like blood pressure. It turns out that for a lot of conditions, weight is a physiologic measurement. So whether it be heart failure or what have you. So blood pressure, weight, respiratory rate, heart rate, all of those are easy collected by a variety of sensors now. Some are patches, some are old-fashioned cuffs that you put on for blood pressure, et cetera. And they can be collected by FDA-approved medical devices. In most cases, that's going to lead to a reimbursable event if you do that. That's another part of the strategy, is who pays for what. So that's one category, and it's very illness focused, and it's very kind of chronic illness management focused. And I'd say the end game of that category of collection is to manage those patients more efficiently, keep them healthy in the home, keep them out of the high cost part of the healthcare system. So the emergency room, the doctor's office, the inpatient service. And of course, that means that you have to have a value-based mindset to make it work. So that's that. The other large category are things like step count, or how well did you sleep last night, or things like that. They come from mostly consumer devices. Most of the time, they're not FDA approved. And most of those kind of fall under the wellness banner. You'll see more of that in the health plan / employer marketplace than you will in the hardcore medical chronic illness management marketplace. Of course, there are overlaps. Diabetes is an overlap condition. Obesity is an overlap condition. You can see people doing either. Of course, Livongo is very successful, but mostly in the employer space, whereas a company like Vivify had similar success, but in the chronic illness management for healthcare organization space. And I think that there are two things about the strategy. One is the dilemma that we face in what to collect. Again, you can monetize those hardcore medical data sets now, either by saving money or by billing CPT codes. That you mentioned that in the beginning, that there are now CPT codes for that activity. it's really hard, much harder to monetize a step count, and yet there are a lot, getting back to the journal now, we see a lot of papers, for instance, where people can do things like, based on your activity data, they can predict whether you're in the early stages of Parkinson's before you show any other effects. So there's that side of it too, which is the marriage of artificial intelligence and some of these data. So it's a fun area. Obviously, I'm passionate about it. I think we've always had a challenge with those more kind of soft signs, things you get from Apple Watch and Fitbit and whatnot, and how to fit those in.
And I guess patient-generated data is the term they're using, and it's very general, right? So recently learned, like, patient-reported outcomes data, so survey data, isn't really part of the RPM strategy, and yet with
That's
all of our partnerships, that seems to be the gold that industry is at least looking to incorporate.
Yeah, so you could even add and I should have mentioned this, but there's another layer, which is patient self-report versus device
Right.
derived, right? And so I have been a prejudice towards more device derived data over the years because it's a source of truth. For instance, I have a Withings weight scale in my bathroom, and I step on it many mornings, but I get off it as soon as I see the number because I don't want that number recorded, right? We can all trick these systems. People, when Fitbit came out, some smart ass people would put them in the dryer and get their step count up by letting them go in the dryer. So, but it's even worse if you're self-reporting, right? Because you can make anything up if you're self-reporting. And
Yeah.
we have, I think it's 163 forms of unrecognized cognitive bias that we all carry around. So if anyone thinks they're not funning themselves, they are. So that's why I think self-report is challenging.
I never heard that stat on cognitive bias. Wow.
There's
All right.
pretty interesting stuff. Yeah.
It's crazy.
Connor.
Joe, this is great. I really appreciate the talk today. Really interesting. I could have used this information about 10 years ago. Where were you? Just kidding. One concern I certainly have in guiding innovators along the way is this idea of everybody's excited about digital health products like you were talking about, remote monitoring, but kind of knowing when it's viable, when it's accurate enough to capture the right kind of data. I know for in my old group, we used to use actigraphy, and they were watches that were high quality, like $1,000 research level watches. And even with those, when we were looking at sleep and wake, and we were giving people sleep and wake diaries, electronic ones to fill out, we often would use the two things in combination to try and really glean the truth. But as and doing intakes with innovators, people just pop off with ideas about, oh, well, we could use this to do this and that and the other. And I'm often scratching my head wondering about the quality of it, given that it seems like a lot of these companies are making claims that are unfounded and certainly not scientific. And that's just one of my kind of thoughts on this.
Well, thank you. And so just to quickly kind of add or underscore the layers to that cake. So there's a layer of again, as an editor, I see a lot of interesting research that never makes it to a product at all. Because why? I don't know, because maybe no one's interested in picking it up or whatever, or the research sometimes small, even if you get the right sample size, it's still relatively small to the population and things don't work as well or what have you. So there's that. Then there's as you say, the products that are out there. And I think these days, most of these organizations are venture funded. VCs are very impatient. As you know, they need to turn that money into a return for their limited partners. The arc between good quality clinical research being designed, executed, and published is a lot longer than they're comfortable with. So they're likely to say, let's just do a few market research studies, or let's do a few focus groups or something and move it that way. So that's a bigger issue. We have to solve that. I'm all about how can we solve that? And there are some ways to do. Just one very quick example is you can do without, for instance, instead of randomizing a control group, you can go in and pick out, let's say you have a heart failure intervention, you can study that intervention, and then you could go into RMDR and pick out 3 or 4 times the sample size of patients that match exactly your sample but never saw the intervention, and do what's called a case control study. That's quicker. So there are ways around it, but it's complicated, and sometimes markets accept concepts that aren't fully vetted in the peer-reviewed world. It happens. One little quick study, and then I know Yuri has a comment, but we worked with a guy before the Fitbit came out who was a hardcore engineer and had a very accurate pedometer, smart pedometer, and actually a proprietary wireless technology, but was this before low energy Bluetooth. So it was a great thing. We would clip them on our shoes and wear them around, and we loved tracking activity. And then Fitbit came out, and he came to me and he said, theirs isn't accurate. And I said, oh, okay. And he had good data on Fitbit. Fitbit actually it just a little bit makes you feel a bit better about yourself than you really are. It's a little, so Fitbit, for a lot of reasons, not just because of that, but for a lot of reasons, became a public company. But it wasn't because they had the most accurate sensor. So these things kind of come in the market like that. Yuri, what was your comment or thought?
Yeah, hi Joe. So it's amazing kind of have you be among us so we can get this inside scoop on a lot of what's going on in the industry. So I wondered if you could give us a sense. You mentioned you get a lot of submissions in your journal that are kind of no longer innovative. And so you see things that are published, but also things that are not being published. Can you give us a sense of what categories of innovations are kind of trending right now in terms of what's hot and what's not? So what's kind of gotten stale and isn't interesting anymore?
Yeah. Well, I mean, AI, when the journal was launched, so I did not launch the journal. I took it over 2 years into its infancy from Eric Topol and Steve Steinhubel out of Scripps, who launched it. And it was launched to all sorts of digital medicine interventions. 60 to 70% of our, maybe even more, papers now are AI. AI has become just this enormous force. I'd like to see a broader portfolio of stuff, but what we get without asking is a lot of AI. And some of that just isn't innovative anymore because I think all of you probably know this. There's a lot of data sets and there are a lot of off-the-shelf algorithms. So once again, as I was talking earlier about observational research, AI can be that way too. Let's take a data set, let's apply this algorithm to it. We'll figure something out and we'll publish it. And we get a lot of that. And it's just, sorry, that's not interesting. If it's not clinically relevant, or you can't, like, I forget, there was one recently about predicting something in the emergency room. And we just sort of said, we're not going to review that because even if it does what you say, it's no better than having a doctor go in and look at the patient. We can't, so the bar for what AI innovation is has become high. One of the areas that is particularly interesting, or there are a couple, but one of them is something called federated learning, which it's about how you can use data sets from multiple different data stores, because the other way AI wins the game is the larger the data set to begin with, the more accurate the tool is. So there are people who can sit in a computer room and it's a little bit like analogous to back in the day when people were doing some of the early MP3, and I can't remember the name of the website, but they would take a little slice of an MP3 file from all over the world and map it into one, and then you could download it. It's a little bit like that. They'll take data sets from all over and normalize them and use them. So that's a hot area. And of course, these days, applying AI to make any decision making around COVID better. Once again, that can't be already made by a person without the AI, because people lose sight of that. It's a little bit like, let's not get too fancy here. So those two areas are very hot. And I think in the sensor space, what I alluded to earlier, which is using sensor data to predict things about diseases or mental states or what have you that we hadn't thought of. So there's a lot of work to predict. For instance, there's a very, we recently published a paper about predicting how people would respond to SSRIs, people with depression, based on, or how they were responding rather, based on step counts. Because as you respond and you get a little bit less depressed, you're more active. So those kinds of what's the word I want to use? Non-obvious predictors using things like step counts or other features of consumer devices are hot as well.
Mhm. Great, thank you.
Joe, so much of what we do in CIDH, like I think Connor said, is around guiding innovators. And I'm sure you've seen a lot. What are some of the common missteps and mistakes you've seen researchers and innovators make within our ecosystem, so we can help steer them not down that path?
Well, good luck with that.
Yeah.
I said to someone the other day that everyone that we work with perceives himself as being one step away from being a Nobel laureate. So there's a lot of ego strength out there. I think people, whatever you haven't done is easy. So if you haven't formed a company, that must be easy, right? If you haven't done the product work, that must be easy. People seem to think that their experience has prepared them to do things they haven't. And again, whether that's be a founder or take something in the lab and move it to a product or any of those things, I think helping people appreciate that. How about if we get someone on the team that's done that before, right? How about if we surround you with people who can help you succeed? Another thing that I think people confuse, and I was guilty of this a dozen or so years ago when we launched a company, is your own personal success with the success of the company. And so if you're going in that direction to commercialize your innovation, you pretty much give up your own success at that point. It's no longer about you and how many papers you publish and whether you become a professor or department chair. It's about whether that innovation succeeds, especially if you take outside funding, right? Once you take other people's money, it's not your personal thing anymore. And and that's hard. I think that's hard. Again, we have a lot of people around us with a lot of, and rightfully so, they're all brilliant people, right? So there's a lot of ego strength there. And so helping them realize that, sacrificing their own success for the success of the company is a really important step. So those are a couple.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. I see Connor's got his hand raised again.
Those are great tips, Joe. Thank you so much. For power calculations and such, and excuse my naivety here, but is there gray area involved with power calculations, or are they pretty straight ahead? Like you can pretty much say, if we achieve this N, we should be able to address this specific question, etc.
Yeah, so a few things happen there. The answer is there's grayness in the calculation itself, and I'll speak to that in a minute. But once you decide we need a sample size of X, people almost always overestimate how quickly they'll get there. Recruiting is an enormous burden on studies, especially at least when I was in this game, we used to do things like we did the wonderful research. Samsung funded it, and it was a really interesting algorithm but they insisted that we give everyone a Samsung watch. So when we recruited people, we had to convince them to wear a Samsung watch, and that was like really hard. So people load up their intervention with things that make it hard. But in terms of the power calculation itself, there's a beginning step. And if you read these in method sections or go to the, again, guidelines and look, is what percentage, like if you want 80% likelihood of success or 90%. And that variable can determine sample in a way that's there can be some gray zone in the how strict do you want to be? And a lot of people, because they're limited by funding, more often not just funding but time, they will push a little bit in the direction of more 80% say than 90%. And that means that when you get that final result, again, there's some wiggle room in this, in whether that represents a truth or not.
Okay, thanks.
We're almost at time, but other
are.
comments? I hope it was helpful. Again, I know you guys aren't actually doing this work, but
Actually, we just submitted a paper last week from the Peace of Mind pilot. Connor, Ramona, Dawe, Molly. I
excellent.
think, yeah. And so but this is very helpful to also help us guide people, which is,
Yeah.
you know, and I think knowing that you're also open to help guide innovators directly too and be part of consults.
Sure.
I think, you know, a resounding theme we hear is we don't know how to be successful in this space here, right? You know, and there isn't, you know, you're the thought leader,
Yeah.
but there's no like department of digital health per se. You know, it's still kind of seen as part of IT or a little bit of biomed or, and so,
Yep.
you know, I think people really struggle on how can I be successful in this emerging field when,
That's fair. That's
yeah.
fair. There. I'll say just I mean, we have a couple minutes. I'll just do a quick comment on that. There, what I call the most well-worn road is the road of NIH funding and basic biomedical research, right? Everyone just, oh my God, they'll throw a robe on your back and like you're the prodigal son, they'll put a ring on your finger and guide you down the finish line. Part of the reason for that, and this sounds cynical, but it's just true, is that every NIH grant has, I think, 80% overhead that comes with it to the institution. So you're bringing revenue in. Now, the research people will tell you, oh, it doesn't pay for it and so forth, but there's a business there and it's an important one. And also, of course, I often say our organization is really a scientific organization that does clinical care on the side. So a lot of priority setting is about that biomedical path. There's not as much, when I started, there was zero peer-reviewed funding in this space. Now there's some, you can get some. So not to say that should be a goal in and of itself, but it's just something to be aware of. I think we still face, and I've said this, we need to do better at this if we want to keep our innovators in Boston and not have them fly across the country, which a lot of them do. We still face a challenge in that our department chairs, senior mentors are a little bit ambivalent about success in digital health, right? Because it doesn't necessarily bring that overhead. It doesn't bring that prestige. It doesn't. And so we get a lot of people that kind of get discouraged early on and they'll jump ship and run a startup or go to work for like a Medtronic or what have you. And I think that's unfortunate. So that's, I mean, there's some, we could try to work on that as CIDH. We could try to make it cool. That's something we could tackle, but I do think that there is that gap. Now, maybe we've got new, as you know, David's our new hospital president. Maybe he'll care about this and maybe that'll change. But that's, I think, and so the other thing we could do, the collective we, is find ways for that to, like, maybe they always talk about how these companies are going to generate royalties and whatnot, but so maybe that's the answer, is that digital health becomes cool because it's a good way to bring that a different funding stream in. Anyway, that's a thought.
Oh, that's awesome. And our two of our executive sponsor, David Lewis, who most of the people haven't had the chance to meet him yet. And Harry Orff, our SVP for research, are actually going to be meeting with Dr. Brown, our new president, about CIDH sometime in the next 2 weeks. So, and I've worked a little bit with him and know him to be very innovative and has fostered a lot of experimentation within his own department around all things data and digital health. So I'm really excited to
Good.
hear it. So
Thanks for listening to me, guys. Take care.
thank you, Joe. This was awesome. Thank you so much. And we definitely will use those slides.
Okay. I'll send them along.
Thank you. Thanks,
Thank you
guys.
so much.
Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot. Thank you, Joe.